Something huge is happening in the world of money. It's a shift that's been quietly building for years, but now it's hitting the accelerator, and it could totally reshape the global economy as we know it. And at the very heart of this change is a deal, basically a handshake agreement made half a century ago that propped up the US dollar and really defined global power. Well, that deal is now over. So the big question on everyone's mind is, what on earth happens next? To figure that out, we've got to talk about de-dollarization, this systematic global move away from the US dollar being the one currency to rule them all. And the story really kicks off with the end of that 50-year-old deal.
Okay, so to really get where we're going, we first have to understand the agreement that just kind of faded away.
So picture this, it's 1974. The US had just left the gold standard and things were a little shaky. A really critical deal was struck. The US promised military support for Saudi Arabia, and in return, the Saudis agreed to price all their oil, which basically meant most of the world's oil, only in US dollars. That deal just quietly expired in the middle of 2024, bringing a 50-year era to a close. So why was this one deal so incredibly powerful? Well, it created what we call the petrodollar system. It was this brilliant, self-feeding financial machine. Let me show you how this whole thing worked. The basic idea is actually pretty simple, but it's genius. Oil is the single most important commodity on the planet. So if every single country needs US dollars to buy it, you've just created a permanent worldwide demand for your currency. Now, this is where it gets really clever. The system fed itself in this perfect loop. So countries buy dollars to get oil. Oil producers like Saudi Arabia end up with mountains of these dollars. What do they do with all that cash? They recycle it right back into the US by buying US debt, treasury bonds. And that, in turn, helped fund the US government and kept our borrowing costs incredibly low.
And boom, this chart right here just shows you the insane scale of that recycling in action. Just look at that black line for Saudi Arabia. You can see how for decades, billions and billions of their oil profits came flowing right back into US government bonds. It was the perfect financial engine, really, and it kept the dollar at the top of the food chain for 50 years.
So if this system was so great for so long, why is it cracking now? Well, it's a potent mix of geopolitics, simple economics, and a growing desire for countries to just control their own destiny. It's really a perfect storm. One of the biggest drivers was the so-called weaponization of the dollar. When the US uses sanctions, it can freeze a country out of the global financial system entirely. That sent a chill through a lot of capitals. Nations started to see their dollar reserves not just as an asset, but as a potential vulnerability. Add in the simple desire to save money on trade and the rise of new alliances, and you get the world we have today. And if you want to see this in real time, just look at Russia. Before the 2022 sanctions, more than 40% of their central bank reserves were in US dollars. It was a cornerstone of their financial strategy. And then, bam, the sanctions hit. In less than 2 years, they were forced to dump dollars like crazy, and their holdings crashed down to about 15%. For the rest of the world, that was a massive wake-up call. What happened to Russia could happen to any of them.
So here's the really important thing to get. This de-dollarization isn't happening at just one speed. You have this slow, gradual decline as markets just naturally evolve. But then you have this faster, accelerated shift where countries are actively making policy changes. And on top of that, you have these super fast, forced transitions like what we saw with Russia. All three of these are happening at the same time. And leading that accelerated shift is a powerful group of countries that are actively trying to build a whole new alternative to the dollar-based world.
And that is the expanded BRICS Plus bloc. Now, with huge oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the mix, this group represents a massive piece of the world's population and its economy. That collective weight gives them a real shot at creating a parallel financial universe. And they're not just talking about it, they're actually building the plumbing. China's SIP system, for instance, is a direct competitor to SWIFT, which is the main messaging network for big international bank transfers. Russia built its own version too. This lets them trade with each other in their own currencies, completely sidestepping the dollar. And the rise of new digital currencies could make all of this even easier.
Okay, so we've got global power shifts, new financial plumbing, but what in the world does any of this have to do with your daily life? Why should you care? Well, there are really two big arguments here. On one side, you have the fact that the dollar is just so deeply embedded in everything. The markets are huge, and people still trust U.S. institutions. But on the other side, the momentum for change is just undeniable. The risks and the economic upsides of moving away are pushing more and more countries to look for an exit. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Not a sudden crash, but a steady chipping away at the dollar's dominance.
So how does this hit your wallet? Remember that recycling loop we talked about? If countries like China and Saudi Arabia start buying fewer U.S. government bonds, the U.S. might have to offer higher interest rates to find new buyers, and those higher rates could trickle down to you. We're talking more expensive mortgages, car loans, credit card debt. It could also mean prices for things like gas, and anything imported could get a lot more volatile. This is a fundamental rewiring of the economy, which brings risks, but hey, it also brings new opportunities. So if the dollar's reign as the undisputed champ is fading, what's next? What does the future of money even look like? Well, the general thinking is we're not just swapping one king for another. It's not like the Chinese yuan is just going to take over. Instead, we're probably heading towards a multipolar world where you have several major currencies, the dollar, the euro, the yuan, all acting as big players in their own regions. And this chart, wow, this really puts it all into historical perspective. It shows us that having one currency rule the world is actually the exception, not the rule. You can see the torch being passed from Portugal to Spain to the Netherlands, France, and then Great Britain. Empires rise, and their currencies rise with them, and eventually they fall. The US dollar has had an amazing run, but history tells us that no king rules forever. So the big takeaway here is this. We are living through a truly historic financial shift. The world is moving away from one center of gravity towards many. That change is happening right now. The real question for all of us is what this new era of money is going to mean for global stability, for the balance of power, and of course, for our own financial futures.